Charlotte, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I like to start every interview by asking guests, as a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I was thinking about that question beforehand,
Mhm.
and I think I always wanted to be a writer of some kind,
Mm.
but I also did a lot of visual art when I was
Ah,
young. I loved drawing and painting, and I always took a lot of art classes in school and in high school. I did AP art and I went to
ah.
art camps and things like that. I always kind of thought that I would be more involved in visual art. And I think there are sort of traces of that in what I've written about. I
Mm.
started my career actually working on the arts desk for a newspaper. So there was a tie-in. I also used to write about fashion. So there were sort of artistic elements of
Mm.
what I was writing about. But I remember I was talking to another journalist who had actually gone to grad school for art and then ultimately became a journalist and didn't write about art.
Interesting.
And I asked
Mhm.
him how he felt his advanced degree was related to the work that he did now. And he was like, well, it taught me to really look at things.
Mm.
And I'll always remember that. And I think it does have a relationship to some of what I do now, even though a lot of what I write about now is more kind of advice type stuff that really has very little visual elements to it. But I think that people respond to visual metaphor. I'm very visual when I'm writing. I sort of like imagine
Mm.
scenarios, stories, and I kind of like picture scenes happening and conversations. And
Mm.
I think that I knew I wanted to do something creative and something that involved producing things,
Mm.
but I don't think I spent most of my childhood thinking I would become a journalist.
Mm. That's interesting. Oh, and for those who don't know you, can you share a little bit about what you do today?
I am a freelance writer. I'm a columnist for New York Magazine's The Cut, and I write a financial life advice column. But I also write about other things for them. I'm working on sort of like a wellness type series for them about how to behave in certain sensitive health
Mm.
related
Mm.
scenarios. I'm mostly really interested in how different tricky things affect people's relationships and lives. So
Mm.
when I write about money, I'm really interested in how that affects people's identities and their
Mm.
relationships. To me, that's the most interesting part of it. I also write for the New York Times, written for their well section, their styles section, and their business section. So I cover a lot of different topics. Right now, my sort of bread and butter is more money, personal finance related things, but I used to be the features editor at Harper's Bazaar. So I've also profiled a lot of interesting people, written a lot about art and culture. So I've really been all over the map. And in many ways, I don't even know if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing yet, if that makes sense. Like, I
Mm.
don't feel like
Mm.
I have arrived at my career. I
Oh,
feel like
that's
I'm still kind of
interesting.
way to something else. And sometimes difficult. Sometimes just feel like I write about a lot of different things and I'm interested in a lot of different things. And
Mm.
a lot of people have asked me if I want to write a book about finance or money. And I never do. I don't feel like
Mm.
that's sort of like reached this defining beat that I want to be on for the rest of my life.
Mm.
It still feels like it's kind of a pathway to something else that I haven't totally
Mm.
figured out yet. So I try to be okay with that. Sometimes I'm like, what am I doing? I don't feel like I am what I'm supposed to be when I grow up yet.
That's so interesting. When I was little, if I thought about a writer, I would think about someone who's doing what you're doing today. And
Hmm.
so,
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah, because I've had authors and a whole bunch of different careers on the podcast. And I think you're the first who's writing for like an official, respected publication. So it's interesting that you're still trying to figure it out, like what it is you want and how that's going to play into something else later.
Yeah, I know a lot of writers who write about very distinct topics
Mm-hmm.
and they're really passionate about that topic. Sometimes I'm so jealous of them because they have
Mm.
carved out this niche that they'll be exploring for the rest of their lives. And I don't really feel like I have established that yet. Maybe I will always be sort of a generalist, but I look forward to finding a place to settle a little bit more.
Mm.
Maybe I never will. I'm not sure.
Mhm. Do you think that that will be within writing? So like finding a niche within
Yeah,
writing?
I think it will be more of like a topic.
Gotcha. Okay. So not like leaving writing
Yeah.
behind completely. Still writing as the
No.
foundation of whatever it is you're writing about. It's just you haven't figured out what
Right.
it is.
Yeah. People are sometimes like, oh, would you ever write fiction? I have so much respect for fiction writers, but it's not really the element that I really love about writing is also reporting. I love talking to people and hearing about their stories and then kind of like finding a larger narrative between multiple people's experiences and sort of creating something that other people can relate to. And a lot of people can relate to fiction, but I have a hard time finding something out of nothing. I really need to talk to people and incorporate different voices into something.
Well, and that makes me think of a piece I read from you that you wrote on, I think it was called The Late Person's Guide, or it was about people who are always late. And
Chronically late.
yes.
Yes.
And I think about that article all the time now after I read it. It's just such a great writing, such a great article. So just to be clear for listeners, I'm very punctual for work things. For personal things, it's when I struggle. and and so reading your article was fascinating to me. And what made it so interesting was you didn't just say, oh, leave 5 minutes early or leave with a lot of time before. You explored almost like the psychology behind the reason people are late. You didn't just dismiss people as they just don't care, although that was something you did talk about a little, but it was more of what's the thinking behind someone being late. And there's also almost like a compassionate tone to it. It's like, oh, if you're a perfectionist, that might be a reason you're always late because you're trying to do more, which is something I identify with. Yeah. So as you're talking about, the human element and how we can relate, I really related to that article and I found it really useful. And there's something there about the people element, how you were analyzing it, writing it in a way that was accessible and there was something to be learned from it. And it was people centered. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, thank you for reading and thank you for saying those nice things. I think that is something that is also a through line of my work, especially as I have started getting more into the very nebulous field of advice giving. And I think I've always been a pretty empathetic journalist. I've definitely had to profile some people who weren't entirely likable, but for the most part, I've never been trying to like do a takedown piece of someone. I think it's healthy to have a sense of skepticism when you're profiling somebody or a little bit of a critical eye, but I've never been in a position of doing like political profiles or anything like that. So when I think you're writing about a subject, it's important to give somebody the benefit of the doubt. I think that in giving advice, it's also important to tell other people to give other people the benefit of the doubt. I think that most people are really like trying their hardest. And sometimes that effort is still not good enough. I'm thinking in particular of sometimes I get emails from readers who are dealing with a relationship question around money and their partner has done something that's really upsetting. Of course, I still want to give their partner the benefit of the doubt if they are really trying to make sense of what happened. But on the other hand, there does come a point, obviously, where you need to come to a realization that sometimes someone else's effort or lack of effort is still not good enough for you. And you're ready to not to go on a tangent. But for the most part, I do, for example, like the lateness piece, a lot of people are really upset when someone else is late. And my husband being one of them, I talked about that a lot in the piece. It has led to some of the biggest fights in our entire marriage. And he just sees it as this real sign of disrespect to him when I am late. And that is really not how I mean it. I have been late in situations where I have the utmost respect for the other person many, many times. And it's like a chip is missing from my brain or something. And I've really had to work very hard in changing my thinking and my habits in order to be on time for things, both with him and with other people. It's not just something that affects him, unfortunately. It's something that affects many other people in my life as well. And so I think it's important to be empathetic, not only to people who are going through a problem, but also to the people who are experiencing those problems too. Sometimes people just have a really hard time organizing an area of their life or thinking about an area of their life. It's just like they're very ashamed of it, or it just really is at odds with something. And to try to kind of figure out what that is in a way that doesn't make them feel worse about it.
Yeah, that gets them exploring and curious. As you're writing, Charlotte, because you're a good writer and you write for one of the most respected publications, how do you think about writing? So I imagine this empathy piece is a big piece of when you're writing. What do you think differentiates a struggling writer from a successful writer?
That's a really good question. I think some of it is innate. I grew up reading a lot, and I always just did well in classes where writing was a component. In college, I basically chose all of my classes based on whether the final was a paper or a test because I was really bad at tests, but I could always muddle my way through a paper if I had to. I even took a science class where the final was a paper.
Wow.
What's funny is I know a lot of great writers who don't write at all for work. Just because you're good at writing does not mean that people necessarily enjoy writing. And conversely, I know a lot of people who love writing, but who aren't very good at it. And I think that's also interesting too. And anything that's published has been edited too. So I think it's important to also acknowledge the work of editors in any published writers. But just to try to answer your question, if you're ever intimidated about someone's writing, track down some of their earliest pieces and you will feel better about yourself. Like experience creates much better writing. Some people are really just amazing writers in their early 20s or teens or even earlier than that. And that's extraordinary. Universally, writers, if they really dedicate themselves to it, get better and better and better. And Toni Morrison wasn't published until she was in her 40s or something. A lot of writers don't really come into their craft until later on in life. I think it's a combination of some of it is innate and how much reading you did when you were growing up and that kind of thing. But a lot of it is just grinding through it.
Yeah. And something I've been reflecting on lately is how even when we're not, quote, official writers, as that is our career, there's so much writing and so much that we do on an everyday basis for a lot of people, whether it's an Instagram caption or an email to a work colleague. I have been paying attention and I noticed my daughter's preschool teacher is such a great writer and she'll write updates for the class and they're funny and they're sweet. I told her the other day, I said, have you ever considered writing a children's book because you're just so good at it? And she's like, oh no, I haven't. It's just kind of a fun thing she does. Sometimes I'll send an email and I'm like, I know there's a better way to write this where it comes off more casually. I don't know. And so I've been really trying to pay attention to it and be intentional. What would you say to people who are saying, well, I don't really want to be a writer, so this interview doesn't apply to me, but like, what would you say to the importance of writing, the importance of paying attention to it? Because I feel like there's so much power in writing, even in a text message. I see some people who are just so short, and there's nothing wrong with being short, but they don't sound the way they talk.
Right. I totally agree with you on all these points. I think everyone's a writer now because so much of the way we communicate now is through writing, through text and through social media more broadly, through email. I think that those skills are really important. Everyone should be able to write clearly at the minimum. I really cringe when people can't punctuate properly. And I know that that's not what they mean, but to me, it's almost a sign of disrespect that they didn't. But some people just really aren't built that way. Like my husband is one of them. He's like really terrible punctuation. When certain people tweet and they misspell words and miscapitalize words, like to me, it's disrespectful of the message they're trying to send. And language is the most powerful tool that humans have. I mean, maybe this is an overreach, but to me, it's kind of like disrespectful to your fellow human. The incredible amount of history and intricate development that has happened to make language effective. So I think it's something that people should take care with. It's also really possible to overthink the language that you're using, and that can be paralyzing. And I don't want people to pore over every email and text message that they write, because ultimately you should be able to kind of use your instincts too. Looking at how other people communicate, people that you really admire and you feel like they always communicate clearly and in a way that is authentic to them. I'm always really amazed when I meet someone who's really funny and warm over text, but then in person, they're sort of cold, where they're much more removed. Some people are like that. Some people just are different in text than they are in real life, which is always very intriguing to me. Once when I was having trouble writing something, I was telling a friend who's another writer that I was having trouble with it. And she was like, what if you just write it as if it's an email to a friend? And that to me was really helpful. So sometimes when I'm having trouble starting a piece that I'm writing, I just think as if I'm writing it to a friend. I was once interviewing a professor who studies time management, and he was like, people just get really intimidated by writing things, especially long form things like, for example, a paper or a thesis, or even just in more regular life, probably like an important email or anything with high stakes. And he was like, oftentimes when my students come in and they're having trouble, I just tell them to sort of tell me what the written piece is about. And he'll hit record on his phone. 4 or 5 minutes later, he's like, okay, I'm going to send you this recording and just write it down, and you'll have a first draft of your piece. So a lot of times people, especially if they're not, writing doesn't come easily to them, which I don't think it comes very easily to anybody. Sometimes just talking it through can be really helpful. And there are ways to kind of like untie the knots that you get in when you start writing something.
I was reading a book by, I think her name's Anne Handley, and she has like a book on writing content. It's like a handbook, and she's really funny. And she said one of the things she does is if there is a piece of writing that she really likes, she'll copy it, or she'll literally just type it out word for word. Or
I love that.
Or write it down word for word, just copying it, just so she can pick up on the tone,
like the turn of phrase.
Yeah, which I thought was fascinating. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I've never considered doing that, but that makes sense.
Yeah, we all get very stuck. I mean, I'm so guilty of this, of certain stylistic habits that we almost don't realize that we're doing.
Interesting. But in your writing.
Yes. But also in writing, like I use a lot of em dashes and kind of like interrupt my own sentences when I'm writing, which is also kind of how I talk. So it makes sense that I do that, but I so admire people who just write very clear, crisp, straightforward sentences. And I constantly am trying to do that more, but it doesn't come very easily to me.
Have you met Laura Belgray? She's been at a couple of events.
No, I haven't met her. No, I know who she is.
Yeah. She says her thing is EFAB, email for a bestie. So to think about when you're writing, do the EFAB where you're writing as if to your best friend, which I think is what you're saying here, which is like talking it out and making it more casual. All of it kind of centers on doing more of it.
It does. It centers on doing more of it. But I agree that trying to kind of like take some of the formality and therefore some of the intimidating qualities out of it. There's also an element where people are really informal on email and text sometimes. And I'm a big fan of, if you tend to be someone who uses exclamation points, trying to limit 1 per email. I think that's just a good rule.
I'm definitely exclamation point.
I think a lot of people, again, especially women, do it as a way to seem friendly, which I totally understand.
And as a people pleaser, that's me.
Are very friendly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's very understandable why people do it. But I think it also creates a little bit more of like a measured and secure tone if you don't use it. It's almost kind of scary sometimes to like not use an exclamation point in email.
Oh, I have to
like very firm.
I have to go back and reread it and like take out the exclamation, like I have to be very intentional about it. Well, anything else that you could think of when you think about if someone's like, I want to be a better writer. Here I am listening to someone who does this really successfully. What would you say?
I think the tip of just reading a lot, but really making a note of writing that you like and want to emulate. And if you're ever stuck on something, going and finding a piece of writing by a person that you really admire and just kind of reading it and absorbing it. And every great writer has at some point gone through like their Steinbeck phase or whatever and wrote in like very tight sentences in that like spare. I'm exaggerating, but I think that everybody, in order to write well, has to try on different voices a little bit and will continue to evolve in their voice throughout their life. But I think it's really helpful to just kind of have a few references that you can pull up whenever you're struggling. I think probably another tip, doing the thing where you talk it out and then record it and then listen to it. I think another thing that is really helpful is after you've written something to read it out loud. And then another thing is to read it in a different format. So sometimes, like if I write most things in Google Docs. And sometimes when I'm on the train, I'll just open it on my phone, and seeing it on a different type of screen when I'm in a different setting.
Oh, interesting.
Is really helpful. Yeah. And I'll be like, oh, this sentence, I really need to fix this. And I wouldn't have seen it the other format, but I can notice it now that I'm seeing it in this new format.
Oh, interesting.
I had an editor once who was really big on, he wouldn't edit things on a screen. He had to edit on paper, which was super annoying. But also he was always like, I like to see things in print. It's just how I like to see it. I like to see it on the page. And he was right that you just catch things when you're seeing it in a fresh format that the eye doesn't necessarily skims over when you're looking at something on a screen or, in the format that you've created.
I do that with my reports that I do. I sometimes am skimming really fast, even though I'm reviewing. But then when I print it out, maybe because I slow down, maybe because it's in that different format, then I'll catch, oh, I missed a word. I misspelled something. That's usually with autocorrect.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen as much, but maybe it's the wrong usage of something that's spelled correctly, or I don't know, whatever it might be. And I'm able to catch it when I print it. And so if there's someone listening who wants to be a writer in the way that you are, what would you say would be kind of a way to start getting their foot in the door?
It's so hard because unlike so many other jobs, there's no defined ladder. I remember graduating from college and just being so jealous of all of my friends who went into finance because they all got like these associate jobs, and they just like had a very clear ladder that it wasn't easy, but the steps were clear. And I didn't have anything like that. And I just was trying to do as many internships as possible. And it was pretty brutal. I was interning at one magazine during the day and then at a newspaper at night. I would like leave my day unpaid internship to go to my night unpaid internship. And it was just like very demoralizing. And I did a lot of opening people's mail, but also just being in the right place. If you're in enough places, then your chances of being in the right place at the right time increases. So I also want to definitely call out the measure of privilege that is just like a huge part of getting your foot in the door. I went to college in New York, so I was already in New York, which just made me physically much closer to publications that could intern for. So I think that was a huge part of it. I graduated in 2007, so people weren't reading things as widely on the internet as they are now. I think now people have a higher chance of being discovered if they're publishing a lot online. But I think that there is a certain level of just grunt work that you have to do that is very unglamorous and that I still have to do. Coming up with ideas and like emailing them around to people and they don't write back, or they say that they love them and then like they never actually follow up, and you just sort of make it, and then suddenly everyone loves everything that you do. It's just a grind no matter what. But I think grad school is not the worst idea. I didn't go to grad school, but I have a lot of friends who went to journalism school and have really great careers. Unlike a lot of other fields, journalism school is not required for jobs. It's not like many other fields where like you kind of have to have an MBA, or you definitely need a law degree, or things like that, where you need like vocational training. I was an English major and I had a minor in creative writing. And there are times when I really wish I had gone to grad school in some way because I really love school, but I'm also really glad that I don't have student loans. So there are definitely trade-offs.
Yeah. Charlotte, was there ever a point where you were like, this is too hard, I'm just going to quit? Or did you know your love of writing would get you through any doubts? Because it sounds like it's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. It's not necessarily that I was like, oh, I'm going to quit writing. It was more like, okay, how can I make my job as with like a sort of editorial sensibility, how can I have a career that incorporates this? So I have done a lot of different types of writing. At one point, I worked for a brand doing editorial work for them, which as a freelancer, it's really good to have that in your back pocket because that copywriting can be a really lucrative and also just everybody always needs a copywriter. So that's a nice skill to have, an experience to have. There have countless times been moments where I've been like, I don't want to be doing this exact thing right now. This is like very common career advice where it's like, okay, what are the skills that you have and how can you apply them? And sometimes you can apply your skills in different ways than you thought you could. I think it's really similar to what you do. You had this career that you were good at, but it turns out that you were happier when you applied them in this other way that you hadn't previously thought you could, right?
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that you still don't know that you're there yet in terms of finding exactly what you want to maybe, or you don't even know if you will, right? Find this one thing that you'll want to find, this one topic or one specific area where you focus your writing. And overall, though, you found this love of writing, that set of skills or that skill that you really enjoy and that you're good at, that you've always known. So if there's someone who is like me in that prior career, or that is feeling like maybe they love writing or they love something else, or they don't even know what they love, but they know they don't love what they're doing. And they're listening to you and they're thinking, Charlotte's built a career around something. Maybe she's not sure what she wants to do long term, but she's built a career and figured out a way to write for a living, doing something she enjoys. If there's someone listening to that and saying, I wish I could do that, what would you say to that person?
I mean, I think most people have skills that they don't know that they have, which isn't to say that it's fully formed and they just have to find it. And you hear this a lot in sort of like job advice stuff where it's like, find your superpower, or like the thing that comes easiest to you is what you should do. And I don't think anything that you're good at comes easily. I think you still have to work really hard at it. Like writing is not easy for me. And there are millions of writers who are much, much, much better than me. But I think that whatever you do that is better than most other people, or whatever you do in your current job that you enjoy the most and that makes the most sense to you, that's a thing that you should explore. It doesn't mean that you know exactly what you're going to do with it. If anything, I think it can be really limiting to people when they're like, I want to be X, or like, I want to be a comedy writer, or I want to write for TV shows. And if you want to do that, that is so great. And I'm super jealous of people who have that kind of direction. But I also think that it can be limiting because it means that you have blinders on for other opportunities that might ultimately be better. And I think also just to allow room for the fact that like sometimes you get someplace and it's not what you thought it was going to be, or the industry changes and it's different, and your vision of what it was or what it was when you first started trying to get there has changed. So I think being able to kind of have some flexibility around that and just be like, look, this is what I'm trying to do right now can be a lot. I think it makes you happier because you're not miserable the entire way, that you're not going to be happy until you get to where you want to be. But B, I think it also just makes you a lot more open to different opportunities that come up along the way.
Yes, I love that. And I agree completely. To close our interview today, as you reflect on the interviews you've done or the pieces that you've written, anyone that stands out to you as a favorite, or someone you interviewed that was just fascinating or interesting, or a piece that you just really enjoyed writing? I know you've done a lot.
I think almost out of self-protectiveness, I tend to forget everything that I've written, like almost immediately after I've written it. Mostly because like when I look back on it, I'm like, oh, I hate this. You have no control over it, right? Like once you publish it, it's out in the world and you can't change it. So out of self-preservation, I really try
to let it go,
to think that much about stuff that I've written. But anything that I can think of is always sort of the most recent thing that I've done. But I would say in January, I interviewed, and I think that this would also be something that people who listen to your podcast might be interested in.
Yeah.
I interviewed this woman who is a decision-making coach. And if you're struggling with one specific decision, she will meet with you for an hour and like talk through all of the different things that are sort of bound up in this decision. And then by the end of it, she will be like, this is what I think you should do. And these are your next steps.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it was really cool to talk to her. And so I did a profile on her for the cut. And I really loved just peeking into her brain. Her name is Nell Wolfhart, and I can send you the piece.
Yes, please share it. And then I'll put it in the links in the show notes.
Okay, great. I think that would be a good, relevant read also.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you? Where can people learn more about you or read your writing?
People can find me on the cut. They can also find me on charlottecowles.com, my incredibly out-of-date website, which I need to refresh. But if you want to reach out to me, which you always can, you can email me. My email address is on my website, or you can reach out to me through the cut. If you find my byline, there's like a little thing you can click and your email will come straight to my inbox.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you. This has been such a pleasure.